Good afternoon. This is Rob Bell, and we're getting the record straight. That's what you're watching. This is indeed the Black Rock and Soul edition or segment. We do two segments. One that's political. It's called Truth to Power, and our music and arts segment, which is this one, Black Rock and Soul. Today's April 5th. It's Sunday afternoon, and as always, right now, I got to tell you to stay safe. Please stay indoors if you don't have to go out. Absolutely have to. Wear a mask, gloves if you have them. If not, try to get them. But please try to stay safe. And from what I'm gathering, most people are doing that out there. It's actually a blessing of sorts to see that folks are really taking heed to what's been told to them. And so let's hope that that continues and we start to flatten this curve out. Please, before the show goes too far, hit the subscribe button. I need more people to subscribe. To doesn't cost you anything, but most of us who are involved, and of course I'm very new to this, but most of us who are involved in this internet, new media kind of thing, need your support, the support of individuals. At some point in the next couple of months, I'm going to try to get support from small businesses in the area, but we're not there yet. At any rate, if you could subscribe now, it certainly will be helpful. And I'm telling you, this independent media thing that's going on right now is absolutely critical as a alternative to whatever it is we see on TV, which is a lot of nothing. That said, have to certainly send our condolences out to the family of Bill Withers. Of course, Bill Withers, one of the great songwriters, singers, and songwriters. First actual show concert I went to in my life, pretty much by myself and with a date in high school, was to see Bill Withers out in Bryn Mawr, as a matter of fact, a very small coffee shop. Unbelievable performance. And I want to say his band was. I can't remember right now. It'll come to me later, but just an amazing performance at that time. One of the true heroes, if you will, of rock and soul, as I like to call it. And just again, one of the great voice. Um, really had a rootsy kind of feel about him, and approach, very earthy, very mundane, but powerful and beautiful at the same time. My favorite Bill Withers cut probably being a Hello Like Before, just an amazing record. And so, you know, another ancestor now, and just one of the greats. Um, of course, you can listen to some of the music that I put on a couple times a week on my YouTube channel, Black Rock and Soul YouTube channel. And I've got a great lineup right now that, again, will be changing up tonight. But a great lineup that includes Kid Creole and Pointer Sisters, the great Betty Davis, a band called Jazz Liberators, Snarky Puppy, vocalist named Emily King that someone just turned me on to. So some new stuff and old stuff, and I think you'll enjoy it. I don't think really right now, as I said, you get 2 hours of music with me, and I don't know anyone who is really putting together as diverse within the what I call the black rock or soul genre, but that's an expansive mode of music, and I just don't think anyone is really exploring the diverse aspects of black music right now. And yeah, I'm patting myself on the back a bit, but I encourage you to check it out. You want to get some old, you want to get some new, you want to really get some innovative yet funky music. www.blackrocksoul.com. Blackrocksoul.com. Check it out. and subscribe. Um, when you get to the website, you can listen to the press and listen to the music, or you can watch some of the videos that I do. And certainly with the Getting the Record Straight videos, please subscribe. Um, when I last talked, we were chatting about how at the end of the 50s, rock and roll basically was going in two broad directions. Um, within those broad definitions, if you will, there were a lot of different genres, a lot of different styles, a lot of intermixing of styles, and a lot of dances that were going on that kind of adhered to and supported the music. I can remember the Philly Dog and things like that when I was a little kid, and my older brother would be dancing to these dances. And of course, I'm in Philadelphia, so you had Dick Clark and Bandstand, started here. And so dance was always a big thing in Philadelphia, as it was in most urban areas and across the country. But it was an integral part of rock and roll, and that's the point that I want to make. And that rock and roll also had had its roots and as its basis, uh, black music. Again, the technical term was rhythm and blues, but out on the streets, out on the dance floors and what have you, they were talking rock and roll and invariably associating that with black music and black culture. Invariably. Uh, Late 50s, you get the movement of rockabilly, which is one segment, one part of rock and roll, but not the original part, but one part of it. And by the 60s, that pretty much waned. And you had, like I said, the music moving into various black genres. And by the early 60s, by 63, you have this British invasion, as well as a whole kind of movement out of particularly the West Coast and LA, that really combined a lot of different genres, but had that country influence and the folk influence, and came to be called rock. It had an edgier, harder sound to it. But oftentimes, the jazz piece would be in there, as well as a lot of it was virtually all of it, in fact, was blues based. And although I'm not going to talk a lot about it, talk some of it as we get more into the 60s. But there was a whole another thing going on, that was coming directly out of black music communities all across the country. And like I said, they were pretty much identified in three geographic areas, mainly Detroit, Memphis, and Chicago. And then, of course, you have to, out of the South, we can talk about three geographical areas and then one man in particular who had his own genre, his own movement, and probably the most important guy individual in terms of rock and roll and soul and all that. And of course, that's the one and only James Brown, who would go on to change music, and in my estimation, is really the most important individual in terms of rock, pop, or soul, because he's the father of funk. And of course, we'll talk about that. We have to devote a whole show to James Brown or two. But anyway, so we had gotten into a little bit about Chicago, and I want to talk some more about Chicago, and we move on. Of course, talk about Chicago music, soul music, rock and roll, whatever. You have to, kind of begin with Curtis Mayfield, a giant, a legend, and his 60s stuff was, fantastic. If there was a choice of colors, People Get Ready, just two classic pieces. Of course, his changeover in the late 60s, where he starts to really funk it out and jazz it up, really, I remember it blew me away, because I'm just going into my, high school years in the late 60s. And really all I remembered about Curtis was People Get Ready, Amen, and stuff like that. But and a lot of it great stuff. But man, when he hits the 69, 70, the game is over. And Curtis goes on to write and play, in my mind, the greatest soundtrack of all time, Superfly. But that's for the 70s, and of course we will talk at long length about the 70s. I don't know how many shows we'll do about that, but just to before I talk about maybe some of the other artists who came out of Chicago in the 60s, or at least got their start in the 60s, I do want to mention about one guy that I stumbled on as I was doing some recent research by the name of John Pate, and then one you may know, Charles Stepney, who's a legend in many circles. But both of these guys were arrangers, producers and arrangers, played behind the scene, orchestrators, wrote the actual music, not necessarily the lyrics to a lot of songs. But again, Pate I wasn't familiar with. I did some reading up on him, but I bring them up because of this. Issues a bad word, but just to the concept and topic of arrangements and arrangers, just something we think very little of, especially those of us like myself. We're not musicians, not trained in music and that kind of thing, just have a layman's interest in music, and just how important arrangements and arrangers are, obviously many of whom are producers. And you hear a lot more about them if you study jazz, if you go back in the history of jazz. Teddy Wilson, I think, comes to mind. But just all of the great jazz orchestras in particular, or big bands. The person who arranged the songs and the cuts were just critical and very important. And because jazz is an important part and really foundational in terms of rock and roll, as I told you before, with Louis Jordan being the father of rock and roll, coming out of the 40s, and also coming out of a jazz tradition. And this kind of flows and evolves into the modern soul and rock and roll music that will come out of the black communities. That arrangement issue, and an arranger and producer that really knows how to arrange is very, very, very important. It certainly takes a absolutely critical aspect in Motown, as well as in Chicago. Also, all the record companies and bands, and music institutions back in the day, and particularly in Philadelphia. Of course, where you have Philadelphia International, which will begin to develop in the 60s. New York also. But anyway, these two guys, John Tate and Charles Stepney, were two of the best in Chicago, and the work that they did was absolutely critical. Stepney would end up doing a lot of work with Earth, Wind, and Fire. Be mindful of that. The arrangement kind of thing we'll talk a great deal more about as we move on to talk about the music of the South and Motown. So on that note, take care. This has been Getting the Record Straight, the Black Rock and Soul edition. Take care.